Hey guys, Adam here from Anvil of War Gaming for another episode of Tackling Terrain.
Anvil of War! Tackling Terrain!
So today we're going to be covering how we made these rock pillars for our swamp terrain set. We're going to cover from the base up to the little details that we included to make these things really punch when you put them on your tabletop. So we need to start with a base. We have to build the terrain piece up onto something. Ideally, basing your terrain on hardboard, pressboard makes them sturdy. It also makes it so that you can create a modular terrain so you don't have a static table all the time. It works really well with gaming mats to be able to kind of shift around your pieces and make a different table every time you guys want to play. So we're going to start with this. And I will show you guys how we made this. So let's jump to the forge. So first we're going to go through all of the tools and materials that you're going to need to finish this project. So we have a glue gun. We also are going to need a foam cutter. Now this is my personal preference for foam cutter. It has the bow shape. It is kind of a nice tool in the sense that it has 3 different ends that are interchangeable. For this part, we're going to be using the bow shape, but there's also 2 additional ends for this. One is really good for cutting into foam and chiseling out brickwork on the side of buildings, etc., or drawing in details like little icons on styrofoam. The third and final end is actually used for cutting more thick styrofoam. It gives you a little bit more control if you're trying to make deeper, thicker cuts. But ultimately, the bow one is the only one that we're going to need for this project. Next, you're going to want to have a mask. Now, I use one that's treated for paint fumes, etc., just because when we're cutting the styrofoam, you're going to want to be doing this in a well-ventilated area and be wearing a mask. Next, you're going to need a couple brushes. I recommend using just some old beat-up brushes or some cheap brushes because you're going to be using this for glue water and for the drywall mixture. Next, you're going to need a marker. You're going to need a hobby knife. You're going to need drywall compound or patch compound, and you can get this at any local hardware store. We're going to need some gardening wire. I picked this up from a local dollar store, and it is already pre-cut into certain lengths. You're going to need glue water. I recommend a 50-50 mix of water to white glue. I use mason jars just because they're easier to clean out. You're gonna need sand. I recommend buying cheap sand at the dollar store. I don't recommend going to a local beach and picking it up because you don't know what's in it. You're gonna need some insulation foam. I recommend the thinner stuff, and the reason is that we're going to be using it to layer. You're gonna need hardboard. You can pick this up at the local hardware store. So then we're gonna wanna draw out the base for this terrain piece. So I recommend making sort of an amoeba shape, think pool, and just kind of draw out a good shape with some big rounded edges that are going to sit flat on the table. So we're going to go cut this out and we'll be back when that's done. So we've cut out the base and we have sanded it down. We want to make sure the edges of this are really, really smooth so it sits flat on the table. So next up, we're going to have to cut out the rocks. This is probably going to be the most time-consuming process of the whole thing. Aside from drying time for glue, paint, etc. So when we're cutting out the rocks, you're gonna wanna use a foam cutter. Let's jump to the forge and I'll show you guys exactly how we got this look. For this part of the project, you're gonna need insulation foam. You're also gonna need your glue water and one of your older or cheap brushes. So we're gonna start by cutting out a few rectangular or square shapes out of the styrofoam. So I recommend just kind of cutting out a grid. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to snap off all the pieces. So as you snap them off, they're going to stack up and eventually form the shape of the rock pillar. Once we have them, we're going to choose like-sized pieces and make sure that they can be stacked up. We're going to use our glue water. And when we're stacking them, we just want to make sure that we are not stacking them so that they're perfectly aligned with each other. We will be able to cut them out and create sort of a more natural look. But when we're doing that, we're going to want to make sure that they're alternating from size to size. The other thing is that we want to make sure that when we create the pillar, we're not creating a tower that's like-sized or like or has a similar depth the whole way up. We want to make sure that it's kind of changing in size as we go. So we're going to start by gluing each piece together. So we just apply a coat of glue on the back side and just stick them together. And we're going to keep stacking them up one by one. And again, while you're doing that, you're going to want to make sure that you're kind of alternating. You're not keeping them perfectly aligned with each other. You want to make sure that it's switching back and forth. And that's the final product. So once we've got it all glued together and it's all stable, this is roughly what it's going to look like. And it is ready to cut with the wire cutter. So we're going to need to be putting on our mask for this step. So again, make sure you're using a mask that's used for paint fumes. And then what we're going to be doing is with our wire cutter, we're going to be cutting down in a sawing sort of motion. And the reason that we want to saw back and forth is so that we get the same sort of texture and the multi-layer to the rock. And as we cut away chunks, you'll see that it starts to get this sort of texture. And we just keep going around. Don't hesitate to turn the project in your hand as you're cutting it. If you turn, you'll take out different little rivets and dents in the rock, which will create, again, more of a definition to the rock. So I've already gone ahead through the magic of editing, and I've made 3 extra rocks. So we've got all 4 of them ready, and we're now going to mount these on our base. So you're going to use your hot glue gun, and you're just going to apply a small amount of glue, enough so that it's going to be secure. And we're going to position these on the base so that they are aesthetically pleasing. So next up, we need to texture the bases. So in this case, we used sand to create a little bit of a texture, and then we put flock on afterwards, but that'll be later on in the video. We used pieces of gardening wire or tomato wire, and we twisted it together, and we basically created little vines coming out of the ground to make it look like a swampy, but also a kind of a jungly terrain. So let's jump over to the forge and we'll show you how we get this next step done. So to create the roots or vines that are going to be running along the base, we're going to take some pieces of gardening wire and we're going to twist them together. So I've gone ahead and made several pieces here. And then once we've twisted all those together, we're going to take each individual one and we're going to twist those all together to create a more thick end product. Once we've twisted them all together and we've created the right thickness that we want, we're going to just take some cutters, some wire cutters, and we're just going to chop them up into sections. I recommend doing about 1 inch to 1.5 inches long sections. And what we're going to do is we're going to twist those up and make them into the sort of root shape that we want so that it looks like it's protruding from the ground. So now that we have the rough shape, we're just going to glue these in certain spots around the base. So we're going to use our hot glue gun again. We're just going to put a little dab on each end, enough that it's going to be secure to the base. But we will be going over this with white glue again as well too. And then we're just going to place them within the rocks. Don't worry about the ends. The ends are not going to blend perfectly well with the base. But that will be fixed once we do the basing with the sand. We're going to take a 50-50 mix of drywall compound or patchwork compound, and we're going to mix it with about 50% water. And then we're just going to use it over top of the vines to sort of blend in the vines and also give them a little bit of a texture and make it so that it's not as obvious that it was gardening wire. Then we're going to take some of our glue water and we're going to go over the entire base to make sure that we are ready for our sand. So when we put the glue water down on the base, again, be thorough, make sure you get every spot, make sure you put a decent amount on, don't be sparse with the glue water. Next, we're going to move on to sanding. So now that it's ready for sand and it's all been glued, we're going to just take a bucket and pour the sand over top. The reason I use a bucket is just to catch all of the excess sand. Our next step is once it's dry, we're going to recoat the entirety of the base with glue water to really seal it in together. Once we seal the base and it's all dried up, we're ready to paint this. So we've gone ahead and already applied primer to the whole base. I recommend not using spray paint because the aerosol will eat away at the styrofoam. So in this case, we've used just an airbrush primer. The next step is going to be painting these things. So this is really open to interpretation. It depends on the type of table that you're trying to create. In our case, for these rocks, we painted them with Vallejo airbrush paints. We started with a darker gray and we moved up to a progressive lighter gray. And then finally we dry brushed them with almost a white color. For the bases, we painted them a dark brown and then we dry brushed them with a Xandri dust, sort of a beigey color. Finally, we did some inking around the base, on the vines, etc., just to kind of make them pop out. And then lastly, we moved on to the detailing. So now we're on to detailing. So we started by flocking the bases and putting some flock along the pillars to kind of create a mossy, kind of overgrown look. So the flock we used is a custom combination of clumping foliage from Woodland Scenics, some of this dried lichen, which we used and crumbled up and put into our flock combination. And then we also used some green moss bought just at a local dollar store, which we used in an actual nut grinder, and we ground up to make this sort of custom color and look, which we found blended really well with our FLG swamp mat. So we spread out the flock all over the base. We tried to keep little pieces of the brown from the painted sand showing up through, just to kind of blend the colors. Then we took white glue and just brushed it on in random places and tried to kind of have the flock looking like it's growing up or down the rock in crevices and to create sort of a vine effect without really needing vines. And then we added the lichen, which we just kind of put hanging, and I gave a quick brush of PVA glue and water just to kind of make it a little bit more solidified. We had it draped down so it looks like it's growing from the little crevices, and then it looks like it's hanging down, sort of a hanging moss. And then we finished by adding all of the plants. Now the plants are all purchased from local hobby stores and craft stores. We have a variety of some aquarium plants, which were chopped up to represent little patches of foliage growing in areas around the rocks. And then we had some more expensive purchases from a local craft store. And these ones came in like a two-tone color and we really liked them. So we chopped them up and we threw them on the base too. Finally, we purchased these little yellow plants. I gave them a quick dry brush with a brighter yellow just to make them really pop. They blend well with the terrain, but they're also standing out and they're giving a good contrast to the bright greens and grays. These were originally from the dollar store and they were used for Easter flower arrangements. We chopped them up, got rid of all of the base and the extra material on them and just kept the tops, and they were pretty cheap. We got quite a few for a reasonable price. And we turned them into these sort of alien-looking foliage, which would be growing in a tropical alien climate. So that's how we created the rocky formations for our swamp terrain set. We hope this inspires you guys to create your own terrain. Enjoy.
Sponsored by
Thanks for watching Anvil of War Gaming. If you like our videos and you want to check out more of our content, click on the links on the screen or below. The next step is going to be dry brushing. No, it's not. It's painting. Are you recording? Why am I still holding on to this white sheet?
I don't know why.
This is for white balancing.